So to understand modern Judaism, we need to see, first of all, that ancient Israelite religion and modern Judaism are really two separate things. They're really two different religions. So the ancient Israelite religion that you might read about in the Hebrew Scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament, that religion is really entirely different from modern Judaism. The main characteristic that they share being the Hebrew Scriptures themselves. We can see in ancient Israelite religion 4 important characteristics that really mark the religion, and that is these 4: people, land, temple, and Torah, or the Scriptures, the Hebrew Scriptures. So it sort of goes like this. In ancient Israelite religion, there is a people who have been chosen by God. So these are a special people that have a special relationship with God. And they have been given by God a special land in which to dwell, and that's the land of Israel. So it's a special people that is a sort of an ethnic identity in a sense, an ethnic religious identity, cultural identity. A special people who have been given this special land in which to live. And they have built there a special place, the temple. The temple in Jerusalem, which is the house of God. It is the one place on earth where God dwells, and He dwells in the midst of His special people in their special land. So there is this connection between the people and God through what goes on at the temple, the ritual that's carried out every day between the people and God. And that is that covenant relationship between the people and God. It's carried out there and symbolized by the temple. And then there's the Torah. So the Torah, or the law, or the Hebrew Scriptures, outline and describe the special way that these people are to live in relationship with God. So they're to be a holy nation, a nation of kings and priests, set apart to live in a special way in relationship with God, carried out at this very special place, the temple, the one place where God dwells, in this special land, the promised land, by His special people. And that really is the essence of the ancient Israelite religion. That ancient Israelite religious culture was dramatically effectively destroyed during the 1st and 2nd century, primarily by 2 events: the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans in 70 CE, and then by the destruction of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, another rebellion, from 132 to 135 CE. Those 2 events effectively destroyed the ancient Israelite religion and any hope that it would be reconstituted or revived. And those 2 events really mark the transition from ancient Israelite religion to modern Rabbinic Judaism. So the Romans had ruled Palestine or Israel since since the 1st century BCE, since 60 BCE. And many of them just sort of went along with it, went along with Roman occupation, were in a sense collaborators, and just did the best they could under the reality of Roman rule. But there was a sizable minority that resisted Roman rule, Roman authority, feeling that Jewish people should rule their own homeland. So a group developed called the Zealots, who mounted an armed resistance against what they saw as Roman occupation, and they developed various guerrilla tactics which today we might call terrorism. But by 66 CE or AD, the Zealots had launched sort of an open revolt against the Romans, and they drove the Roman delegation out of Jerusalem. They were very successful at first. Of course, then the Romans didn't like that, and they retaliated. They sent troops in from the north, from Syria, into Palestine, and there they wiped out the armed resistance in northern Galilee and pushed them south, where they took up refuge in the city of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was besieged by the Roman army, a 7-month siege, until finally the wall was broken through and the Romans stormed into the city. And there they killed and enslaved, and most significantly pulled the Jewish temple, or the Israelite temple, down and burned it, effectively ending the ancient Israelite religion, which had depended on the temple. So the massive defeat and destruction of 70 CE still did not pacify the Israelite Jewish population. And in 132, a new rebellion was launched against Roman occupation. And this is called the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and it centered around a fellow named Bar Kokhba, or called Bar Kokhba, who was widely thought to be the Messiah, or a messianic figure who was empowered by God to drive out the Roman occupier and reestablish a Jewish monarchy. And he was widely supported by a number of important rabbis, now in the 2nd century, and the Zealot movement had come around him. And the rebellion that was launched in 132 then was a very widespread rebellion. There were thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of Jewish insurgents. And again, they were very successful at first. They defeated the Roman forces there in Jerusalem, and a large part of the land, took a lot of territory, occupied a number of Jewish villages throughout the countryside. The Romans retaliated in force. I mean, they had learned the lesson of 70. They weren't going to mess around with these insurgents, and they retaliated in force. 12 Roman legions were sent into the land and quickly overwhelmed this rebellion. And Bar Kokhba and his followers were crucified. Hundreds of people deported, and the land was almost cleared of the Jewish population. So after this point, there was hardly a significant Jewish population in Israel. The city itself, Jerusalem, was turned into a fully pagan Roman city, and the temple to Jupiter was built there on the Temple Mount. And so why? What was behind this insistence of resisting and rebelling against Roman occupation? And really, what it is among other things, it's the idea of messianism, which really increased during the first century. That is, hopes for an independent Israel rose. And the Zealots had this idea that if they started an impossible war, because they could, realistically, this armed insurgent movement could never defeat the massive power of the Roman Empire. So it was really an impossible war they were going to start. But the logic was this: if they started an impossible war, then God would step in, bring the Messiah forth, and would step in, intervene, and defeat the Romans and reestablish the Jewish nation. So this was a way, this idea of launching an insurgency against the Romans was a way to sort of hasten the coming of the Messiah. They really believed that God would step in and they would be successful. Unfortunately, both in 70 and in 132, that didn't happen. And instead, the ancient Israelite religion and the Jewish presence in Israel were virtually wiped out. So in the first century, under Roman occupation, the ancient Israelite religion was under significant pressure. And so the first century was a time of great upheaval and change in Israel. Just the increased diversity of the Jewish or Israelite population. There were a number of different groups developing, including these separatist, nationalist movement of the Zealots. And a priestly caste. The priests who were well off and were intertwined with the Roman occupiers. The revitalization movement of the Pharisees. So this was a sort of a grassroots movement that was calling for a religious and social revival through an increased awareness of moral conduct and an understanding of the Torah and living out the Torah through moral conduct. And then you had other groups like the apocalyptic Essenes who were waiting for the end times to come and who were withdrawn into the desert to await the end times. And on top of all of that diversity and change, then you have just the pressure of occupied life, of Roman occupation, the heavy burden of Roman taxation, so financial issues, even crisis among the Jewish population, and all this religious oppression that they were facing. So under all that pressure, what we really see is three main groups and responses to Roman occupation developing. Three main groups emerged from the upheaval that ancient Israelite religion experienced in the first century. The first was militant nationalism, the Zealots. The second was the early Christian movement. And the third was the precursors for what became modern Rabbinic Judaism. Now the first we've already talked about, and that's this militant separatist nationalism that came to a fore with the Zealot movement and armed resistance against Rome. And we saw the result of this response of militant nationalism. It was a complete disaster for the Israelites and really resulted in the complete destruction of ancient Israelite religion and culture. So while the militant nationalists were messianic, that is, looking for the Messiah to come and reestablish a Jewish or Israelite rule throughout the Romans, this messianic hope was also retained in another movement of the first century, which was not, while it was messianic, it wasn't nationalist and it wasn't separatist and it wasn't into violent armed conflict, but it was quietist. That is, it existed quietly within without resisting the ruling powers. So it was messianic and quietist, and this was the early Christian movement, which coalesced around this figure, Jesus of Nazareth, saw him as the Messiah, the carrier of Jewish hope, if you will, the hope of the nation. Yet at the same time, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." So which allowed this movement, rather than to resist Rome and be destroyed, like the militant nationalists, they were able to live within Roman civilization and develop this movement that became the early Jesus movement. So a second movement was Rabbinic Judaism. And this movement took the Torah as its core and focused on personal obedience to the Torah, knowing and doing the Word of God, knowing and doing Torah. And it also distanced itself from the temple establishment and enmeshed religious observance into the family. So not only did it involve personal obedience to the Torah, but the site of worship moved away from the temple and into the home, into the family, which sort of became the basic unit of Rabbinic Judaism. The basic sacred place was the family and the home. And this also was a very successful movement, and these emphases on the Torah observance, living and doing the Torah, and on family, the combination of that has really led into the development of modern Judaism, modern Rabbinic Judaism.